All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program, Understanding the Impact of Trauma on Families. We had a record number of people register for this program. It's great to see so many of you joining us for this learning opportunity at the lunch hour. My name is Matt, and I am the Community Outreach and Education Coordinator for NAMI Greater Cleveland. Some of you may be familiar with me and with NAMI more generally. We're joined by Brian Strozewski, who is one of the psychoeducation presenters with NAMI Greater Cleveland. We're very happy that he's able to educate the NAMI Greater Cleveland community on this topic. Just a few housekeeping notes. Please be aware this is being recorded and will be posted to the NAMI Greater Cleveland YouTube channel later this week. These slides from this presentation will also be made available to you after the presentation. I will send out a follow-up email. Please remember to remain muted during the presentation so we can control for background noise while Brian is presenting. And please also utilize the chat feature if you have questions. I will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. We're hoping to cover most of the content in about 45 minutes so that we will have at least a few minutes for Q&A before we wrap up by 1 o'clock Eastern time. Those are my ground rules for this presentation. Many of you are likely familiar with NAMI already. If you're not, NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. At NAMI Greater Cleveland, we serve Cuyahoga County specifically. Our mission is dedicated to improving quality of life for individuals with mental illness and their families. We do that by providing education, support, information and referral, and advocacy. And you can always go to namigreatercleveland.org to see the calendar of other educational programs that we offer, either in person or virtually. The calendar is always up to date, so you can register for some of our upcoming programs. And you can also always call our helpline if you need referral to services or treatment providers or want to connect yourself or a loved one to NAMI Greater Cleveland services. So with that being said, I will pass the baton to Brian to introduce himself and begin his presentation on this important topic as we continue to highlight trauma in some of our programs. Thank you all for being here.
Wonderful, and thank you for the introduction, Matt. And I want to echo what Matt said. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to present to each and every one of you. I am excited to talk about trauma. It is definitely one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I'm glad that you are all here. So this is a quick outline of what we're going to talk about. Just a quick introduction from me for this presentation with a few invitations. Talking about definitions, because that's how I like to start most of my presentations, talking about defining what we're talking about. I want to talk about families. Of course, that's kind of at the center of our topic, and so we'll get to that. And then jumping into toxic stress and the effects of stress on family systems and on our internal systems as people. And talking about the healing processes and resilience with trauma. And then ending with some Q&A, and I'm going to talk about that here. So the first thing that I want to invite you to do is to create space for yourself to be present and to be regulated and focused. You're here to learn, I imagine. So create that space around you. Feel free to grab something to write notes. I think it's a good idea. It's helpful to learn, sometimes to write things down, and feel free to take care of your own needs. Please feel free to jump in the chat as well. I want to encourage participation, encourage questions. There's a lot of content I'm going to be talking about. And I want to make sure that you feel comfortable and know that you're welcome to jump in. And so if you want to ask a question verbally, that's great too. I welcome all of that. And if there aren't a lot of questions, that's okay as well. I am happy to fulfill whatever your needs are here. And as I said before, if you need to get up, if you need to be standing, if you need to be practicing some of your own mindfulness, if you need a break from the content, if it's feeling heavy, do what you need to do for yourself. I invite you to bring curiosity here. I think a curious orientation cures a lot of problems, but it's generally very helpful. I just ask people to help me stay on track. I get excited about things and can talk a lot. So what that might look like is me saying, I'm going to talk about that later, or hopefully at the end of our session here, when we have Q&A, I can answer that question. But please do feel free to ask questions anyway, and I can work through that. Just please know that I'll be doing what I need to do to make sure that I'm making good time. And of course, I want to invite you to savor this opportunity to learn and grow. Some of this information might be familiar for you, but I hope each and every one of you have something you take away from this presentation. A little bit about myself. My name is Brian Strozewski. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor with a supervision designation in the state of Ohio. I'm a certified clinical adventure therapist. And I'm a counselor, I'm a supervisor, I'm a trainer, like trainings with NAMI, and I'm a consultant. And I have my own practice called Ever Changing Counseling and Consulting in Rocky River, Ohio. And I live in the greater Cleveland area. And I've worked with many, many different people in many different settings, but primarily my work has been with youth and their families, including supervising intensive home-based family treatment out in Lake County, where I had a lot of additional experience working from a trauma-informed, attachment-focused perspective. Trauma is one of my favorite topics to talk about. Anybody who knows me knows that this was formative in me being the therapist I am today. Learning about trauma and educating others in trauma continues to be one of my passions. So again, thank you for being here. I'm honored to start talking about this topic. But before we do, I want to invite each of you to take a few deep breaths with me. Breathing regulates our system. The best way to do it is to breathe out more than we breathe in. That helps signal to our brain that it's okay to be calm or that we are safe. Hopefully you're feeling safe right now. If you're not, do it. You need to feel safe. But anyway, we're going to breathe together. So take a deep breath in for about 3 or 4 seconds. Breathing in through your nose, if you can. And breathing out 3 or 4 or even 5 seconds. I'm going to take 2 more deep breaths. Breathe in and out. And one last time. This is a quote from Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry. Oprah, in the book, What Happened to You, says, "So I'm not crazy." And the response from Bruce is, "No, your brain is doing exactly what you expect it to do, considering what you've lived through." First, we're going to start with a few definitions. The first thing to know about is a crisis. A crisis is an adverse experience of an event to which the individual or system does not have the resources or relationships to adequately cope. And so the important piece here to understand about a crisis is that what a crisis is to one is not necessarily the same as what it is to another. So if you imagine maybe a 3 or 4-year-old with their favorite toy and they've lost it, right? They're probably losing it because they've lost their favorite toy. To them, they might not have the resources internally or externally to cope with losing their favorite toy. And so they're in meltdown mode. As an adult, you probably, if you lost, I don't know, say your favorite pair of shoes, you're probably going to be bothered by it, but it's likely that you have internal and external resources to manage that, including the ability to select another pair of shoes. I suppose if you lost your cell phone, that might be a little bit different. That is often a favorite toy of ours. But even then, losing your phone might not be a crisis to you, but it depends on the person. And so there are a lot of things to consider with a crisis, and this idea of relationships and resources is something that you're going to see throughout this presentation. And so I'll be talking more about that. Traumatic stress, which is like a crisis, right? It's partly from a crisis, is exposure to a crisis that's either isolated, so a one-time event, or ongoing and chronic, that rewires our brain's responses to adverse experiences. And what ends up happening is this manifests in re-experiencing of traumatic events of that crisis or those crises, and avoidance of reminders of those events. Traumatic resilience, then, is the ability for an individual or system to use their internal and external resources to recover and adapt following exposure to a crisis. Traumatic resilience is really important to understand, and how traumatic resilience comes about in critical events, crisis events, is also vital. Before we talk about all that other stuff, I think it's important to talk a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD is a diagnosis that's given to an individual who's lived through a traumatic event or traumatic events, and they develop avoidance and re-experiencing symptoms. And this is at a higher level than just what exposure to a trauma might be. Not everyone who experiences an adverse event is going to develop trauma, and not everyone who has trauma develops PTSD. And so these pieces are really important, because when we use the word PTSD, we're talking specifically about the diagnosis. And in adults, the diagnosis of PTSD has symptoms that include nightmares and flashbacks. So re-experiencing of what happened both while someone's sleeping and while someone's awake. Avoidance of sensory experiences that are connected with the event or circumstance. One of the phrases that we talk about when we talk about trauma is what fires together, wires together. And so the pathways of the brain that are firing during an event that is traumatic tend to wire together. And so that means sensory experiences, things like not just visual cues, but also things like smells, things like tactile sensations, things like certain sounds can cue trauma responses, because these things were happening during the traumatic event. And the brain then reads these things as threatening. Another symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder is loss of memory. So memories related to the event, and sometimes not related to the event as well, or related to the time, the period of life that an event maybe occurred. Negative self-image, shame, and self-blame is extremely common, and one of the most challenging symptoms of PTSD, and one of the symptoms that makes it look a lot like things like major depressive disorder or depression or grief or other sorts of things where the shame and self-blame often are occurring. Also, difficulty experiencing what we would consider to be preferable or positive emotions like joy and calm. Being on edge or anxious often. Having mood swings is a huge challenge for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. This also includes depression and self-destructive choices, which is a quite complicated thing to understand, and hopefully some of what we talk about here might address how some of these symptoms develop. But because this presentation is on families, it's really important to discuss post-traumatic stress in children and teens. And one of the things that I want to note is that trauma looks different for young people than it does for adults. Not always, but oftentimes. And this is because when a trauma happens during a child's development or a teen's development, sometimes the brain is rewired there, and normal developmental course then doesn't have an opportunity to continue the way that we would expect it to continue had there not been these traumatic events that occurred. And so some of the symptoms that we see, and oftentimes, those symptoms don't feel logical, they don't feel rational, they don't feel reasonable, because trauma isn't always a rational response. I'll talk more about what that means in a little bit, but some of the symptoms we see are distrust and guilt and shame in relationships. This can be really, really difficult in families when a child's gone through a really difficult experience and then doesn't trust the people who maybe we expect them to trust, including people like me who are therapists who want to be helpful, or other sorts of providers working with a child, or teachers or other adults. Nightmares and problems with sleep. Issues with sleep are very common, including sometimes bedwetting or bed soiling. Avoidance of sensory experiences, and not necessarily things that we would tie with those experiences. Again, what wires together fires together. And so sometimes there's avoidance of things that we might not even notice or might not recognize as being a traumatic avoidance symptom. Motor coordination and balance problems. This is something that has to do with that development of the brain and the way that the brain develops. And so sometimes we see challenges with coordination. Oftentimes this means things like occupational therapy, and certainly active play can be really helpful for young people with trauma. Difficulty learning and frequent distraction. Oftentimes when someone is having these trauma symptoms and having these reminders, it's hard to pay attention. Sometimes we see symptoms of ADHD that come from trauma because of inattention or hyperactive responses and what we call hypervigilance, over-responsiveness to trauma cues or even to other people, related to that distrust and related to some of the other things that are happening with the brain, especially feeling unsafe. So responding negatively to positive events too is something that occurs often for young people with trauma. Feeling dysregulated and overwhelmed and overreacting to things that we would expect a child to react to differently. This overreaction can look like aggression. It can also look like shutting down and not responding, especially when maybe prior to traumatic events happening, a child was responding. These symptoms, depending on when they happen in development, again, can look very different, especially if it's happening very, very early on before a child has the verbal ability to understand their experiences. And so this is by no means an exhaustive list of the impact of trauma on children, but it's a hopefully helpful general introduction. ACEs, otherwise known as adverse childhood experiences, are not destiny. Even if someone has experienced significant adverse childhood experiences, it doesn't mean that they're absolutely going to have these negative outcomes. This is a quote from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's the author of The Deepest Well. I highly, highly recommend this book. I think it's been super helpful for me as a provider, and I think it is probably generally helpful to people who want to understand more about trauma. Oops. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences research project, the ACEs study, occurred over the course of several decades. And this information came to us in the early 2000s, late 2000s. The ACEs study was really important in helping us understand the impact of trauma on adults. And there continue to be a lot of studies based on the ACEs study that help us to understand more about trauma and the impacts of trauma. And so according to the CDC, ACEs are experiences during childhood that are harmful and potentially traumatic. So this is their basic definition. This is what I was talking about before in the presentation here. And the CDC had a study recently, and in their study, this is what they found. About 64% of Americans have experienced one or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so that's about 2 out of every 3, it's pretty close, have experienced an adverse childhood experience. About 17% have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences during their childhood. And this is really important, 4 or more, as you see below, I'll talk about in a second. This is kind of a threshold or a cutoff for significant impact. About 5 in 100 Americans, so about 5% of Americans have been diagnosed with PTSD at some point in their lifetime, which I found a pretty high statistic. 9 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States are linked to ACEs. And so if you think about that, right, adverse child experiences, these negative, impactful events that happen in childhood, oftentimes they're leading to significant negative medical health-related conditions, and having 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, and the important note here is without intervention, is connected to early death. And according to the research, early death means on average 19 years. 19 years on average earlier, people with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences die. 19 years. And again, so if you've had adverse child experiences, if you're thinking about your own experience, you're thinking, well, I had a pretty adverse childhood. As I go on to define what these childhood experiences were, note that it's without intervention. That's why it's so important to have resources and education and relationships that help us to heal through trauma. So these adverse childhood experiences, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are the ones that have been studied in the ACEs study. And this is something that you can look up. There's lots of information on the ACEs study, and there's a really great website called ACEs Aware that gives lots and lots of information on ACEs and the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And so in the home, this looks like domestic violence, otherwise known as intimate partner violence. It can be substance misuse, particularly by caregivers, caregiver mental illness or incarceration or separation, so being separated from caregivers, and significant physical illness. And so this could be of the child or of the caregiver. When it was researched, this was significant physical illness of the caregiver. This can also look like abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse of a child. Each one of those is a separate adverse childhood experience category. It could be neglect of physical or emotional needs. And as we've been studying adverse childhood experiences more, some of the conclusions are these additional social adversities, which I think that a lot of people have known, but we didn't have the research to be able to talk about this to support that social adversities like poverty, experiencing and witnessing community violence, racism and discrimination, housing insecurity and food security, these things are extremely impactful on children and on their families. They're beginning to be incorporated in the study of adverse childhood experiences and the impacts that these have in later life. So let's take a moment to stretch. This is a lot of information, and it also might be very stimulating information. It's not always easy to talk about trauma and the impacts of trauma. So feel free to take a nice big stretch. If your camera is on or off, whatever your preference is, but take a big stretch, take a deep breath. If you'd like, I invite you to give yourself a nice snug hug. I feel like this can be a really helpful stretch and a really good reminder to your body that you're safe and that it's good to be present here where you are. Matt, I'm noticing that the chat has a few things in it. I haven't checked it. Is there anything that we should stop and address now?
Sure. Yeah, I was just providing some information in the
Cool.
chat, but the question was, is there a difference between the reaction to a one-time traumatic experience versus ongoing chronic trauma? I was writing a little bit in the chat about complex trauma, complex PTSD. So can you comment on that, the distinctions there?
Yeah, I would love to, and it's coming up. So
Okay.
hang on, we're getting there. It's in the next few slides. And this quote's a really good entry to that. But before we move on, is there anything else that we wanted to address or talk about before I move on?
No, not currently.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And thank you for those who are participating in the chat. I appreciate your questions. And please, if there's something that I don't answer, don't be afraid to ask. So this quote here, I think is really important. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She is the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, and she herself is an Indigenous woman. She said, "We make a grave error if we try to separate the individual well-being from the health of the whole." When it comes to trauma, especially for youth, but also for the adults who are caring for our youth, family trauma is shared trauma. The presence and effects of one individual or group's trauma impact those around them. This is a concept that we have defined as secondary trauma. And so one person has the trauma, but then the effects of that continue to negatively impact. Oftentimes, this is siblings or caregivers to the children, their children. And it can certainly also be others as well. Within a family, secondary trauma occurs as relational trauma or interactional trauma. And so this is when feelings of safety and connection with family members are limited because of these effects. This part here is a little academic, so excuse all of the definitions, but their examples are really helpful in understanding how shared trauma occurs within a family. And so this can occur as simultaneous effect. And so this is when all or most or even some of family members are experiencing the same crisis event, same traumatic, potentially traumatic event at the same time as in a natural disaster or the loss of a family member. Vicarious effects is the definition for when a family member is impacted by the experience of another who has had trauma. And so this might be learning secondhand about maybe a parent's traumatic event or overhearing about a trauma that happened to a sibling. And so this is not directly experiencing it, this is just learning of it. And vicarious trauma also is something that often happens with those who are providing care to or providing services to people who have had trauma. And so this is a really important thing to understand, that even just learning about the trauma of someone we care about or we're caring for can have traumatic effects on the way that we see the world and that on the way that our brains experience the world around us. Another way that shared trauma occurs in a family is something called chiasma, traumatic stress. This will not be on the quiz at the end. There won't be a quiz at the end. Just so you know, members are exposed to the experience of another's symptoms of trauma. This is chiasma, traumatic stress. And so this is if someone in a family is causing harm to themselves or is misusing substances, right? These things can have an indirect effect on their family members. And this is kind of those reliving and avoidance symptoms happening for someone, impacting someone else within their family. Another definition of shared trauma that can happen in a family is intrafamiliar trauma. And so this is direct impact from the symptoms from a family member. And so this is someone acting on or towards another member of a family, like in the case of abuse or in the case of a family experiencing a divorce. These shared traumas are really important to understand in the context, not just of the family, but of systems and the environment going on beyond the family. Complex trauma is the intersection of and multiplying of the effect of multiple adversities for a member of a family or for the whole system. And so complex trauma can be just one of these things, but often it's the intersection of many of these things as well. As we know, those who are experiencing poverty or racism and discrimination have experienced community violence, have had medical illnesses. Oftentimes this isn't just one, but multiple of these. Certainly there's not one individual, not any person who is safe from the impact and effects of trauma. Trauma can happen to just about anybody. And in a little bit, I'm going to talk about what those factors are related to who might develop trauma and who might not. Although it's not possible to completely predict what might happen, especially because of all these intersecting factors. Intergenerational trauma then is when trauma is unresolved and passed down through family systems in ways that maintain detachment from healing relationships and supportive connections, and from other sorts of resources as well. And so oftentimes complex trauma then, or other forms of trauma that aren't intervened on, aren't treated, there aren't resources and relationships to help. It can lead to intergenerational trauma happening from grandparents to parents to children, and then moving on to their children. And so this can happen in repeated cycles of abuse, where one person has been abused, they go on then to abuse their own children. or an addiction. And we often see addiction in family trees as we look at family structures. And it can also be connected to bonding and attachment impairment, and those what we want to be healthy connections being unhealthy because they're impacted by the effects of trauma. So I want to talk a little bit about, okay, so if this trauma, right, this is really important to understand, it can have all of these big impacts. How does it happen? What's going on here? And so it's really important to know that stress is not a bad thing necessarily. Stress is actually really, really important for us to perform at our highest level. When I present in a presentation like this, I have a lot of stress as I'm presenting, before, during, not typically after, but sometimes too. But enough stress helps me to perform at my best. It helps keep me on. It helps keep me focused. Without any of that stress, I might take things too casually. I might forget to review my slides. A little bit of stress is helpful. A lot of stress may not be. So stress that's predictable, stress that's moderate, and stress that's brief can lead to potential for growth. Stress that is unpredictable or severe or chronic or prolonged can create vulnerability. And so when we're looking at the stress that someone has, right, we want to help them to have stress that's more predictable, more moderate, and more controlled, especially in families. When we get into the resilience piece, we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. This is important because access to healthy, charismatic, helpful relationships and resources, both internally, resources that I have or I've been coached to or learned or been given, or external resources beyond me, a resource like NAMI, right? A resource like education. Access to these things, relationships and resources, helps that stress that it can be positive, what we call eustress, that potential for growth to be converted into growth through adversity, right? Hopefully, for someone like me who has stress about presenting to people, each time I present, if I have the right relationships and the right resources, and hopefully get helpful feedback from each and every one of you, that will help me then to grow through that adversity. However, those of us who don't have those relationships, those of us who do have those relationships and resources with even those unpredictable, chronic, stressful events, they can develop traumatic resilience because they have the relationships and resources to help them through. And so to further highlight this idea of relationships and resources and the potential for trauma, someone who has vulnerability from their stress, right, but doesn't have the relationships and resources to work through that stress can develop trauma, which is the biological adaptation to that toxic stress. Even in that more eustress, maybe helpful, more predictable, moderate, controlled stress, right, where there is potential for growth, without helpful, adequate relationships and resources, that can be stressful in unhealthy and toxic ways. And over time, that stress wears us down, right? And can lead to mental health disorders and mental illness. And certainly can expose us to have more vulnerability to trauma, including if we don't have the relationships and resources to help our stress, this distress that we're feeling, from becoming chronic or from becoming more severe. And so this idea of access to relationships and resources in families is so important. And it makes it even more important that in families where there is a caregiver who is struggling, or a caregiver who has their own trauma, right, that they're getting the access to relationships and resources that they need so that these impacts of trauma on themselves and certainly on the rest of their families aren't continuing. Are there any questions, Matt, that we want to turn to now?
Yes, we have a couple questions, and
Okay,
I'll
great.
leave it up to your discretion if you'd like to answer them now or at the end. One question we had was, could it be or is it detrimental to a child to be misdiagnosed with ADHD when in reality it's a childhood PTSD diagnosis? That was one question, and the other was, can secrets about intergenerational trauma impact the next generation? How does that
Yeah.
look? Mhm.
Yeah, those are really good questions. The first one, I don't want to speak too much to, I could probably speak a long time. As a clinician, I have the ability to diagnose, and we do something called differential diagnosis, right? Comparing and weighing what fits best here, right? Where are these symptoms coming from? What happened? Even in the title, right, of Bruce Perry and Oprah's book, What Happened to You, right? We're talking about what happened. And so for a child, it's hard to tell if adverse experiences were happening from really early on because their development can't really be seen without the trauma. But it can be helpful to know, were ADHD symptoms present before these traumatic events happened? Because if ADHD wasn't present and then ADHD is, it's more likely that the impacts of trauma are having an effect on that child's neurological system, leading to maybe impulsivity, leading to maybe inattention, leading to things that look like ADHD but maybe aren't. And so it's really important that we're looking at the child's present functioning, but also looking at their history and understanding the difference between ADHD and post-traumatic stress disorder. Both are neurologically based, right? Both have some brain science connections. Um, but just because someone has ADHD-like symptoms doesn't necessarily mean they have ADHD. But also you could have a child who had ADHD and also had trauma. And this can be a compiling effect. So it's hard to know for sure, especially if the trauma happens earlier in that child's development. But it is really important to have an accurate diagnosis, especially if medication is helping to manage ADHD, because what we know about medications for children with ADHD is that medications that help them sometimes are unhelpful or even harmful to children who don't have ADHD. And so to know and understand all this, oftentimes what we want to be doing is talking about ACEs and giving, there are surveys, ACEs Aware even has some on their website. There are surveys that clinicians like me or other providers, including medical providers, can use to screen for adverse childhood experiences. Because if someone is scoring high, like they've had several categories of adverse childhood experiences, it might help us to understand where are these symptoms coming from and help us to kind of weigh out, is this ADHD? Is this anxiety? Is this possibly traumatic effect? So the other question was about family secrets. And um, I think this is something that could be talked a lot about. I know this is something that's discussed pretty thoroughly in the book, What Happened to You. So I highly recommend that. But family secrets certainly can perpetuate the impacts of trauma intergenerationally, because what we know about trauma is that people who have experienced traumas, especially in childhood, often have shame about what happened. Shame tends to be a feeling of I'm bad or I'm not worthwhile. And if we keep that inside, right, oftentimes we can't work through it. What we know about shame is that when we talk about shame, we have less of it. But if we don't talk about shame, we often have more of it and continue to carry it. And secrets can perpetuate that cycle of shame of we don't talk about these really difficult things, and then we don't get the intervention, we don't get the relationships and resources to help us to heal. And what we know about trauma is then it can have these impacts, right, on those around us and lead to continuing traumatic effect. And so it's really, really important to help people to be able to work through what they've experienced. That doesn't necessarily mean pulling out or forcing someone to talk about their secrets, because that's not helpful either. But giving them the resources so that they can work through it where they are is really important. So hopefully that's helpful. There's some more here about resilience, and hopefully that'll give some more information as well. And I'm checking my time to make sure that I'm staying on track enough. So really quickly, just take a moment to notice your body. Notice what's happening internally. Notice your breath. Notice if your shoulders are slouching a little more than they usually are. Notice if your heart rate might be beating a little harder, a little slower than it usually is. Notice if your face is stretching or contorting. You're welcome to change these things if you want. I'm just inviting you to notice. Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. This is from Bessel van der Kolk. He's the author of The Body Keeps the Score. So really quickly, this is not going to be enough time to talk about neuroscience for you to understand the brain completely, but there are a couple concepts here that I think are just really important. And so this is called the hand model of the brain. Dr. Dan Siegel talks about this. There's a TED Talk and some YouTube videos and other providers who know this as well. But I think it's really important to talk about. So when we talk about trauma, we want to make sure that we are talking about the brain and the impact of trauma on the brain. But we need to understand the brain to understand what's going on. So in this hand model of the brain, and I invite you to do this yourself too. It can be helpful to kinesthetically, physically experience the learning and not just hear me talking about it. So I invite you to have your hand up with me. And so this is your brain. Here is our spinal cord, which goes from our tailbone all the way up to our skull, right, and through our neck. And our spinal cord takes in all the external information that's happening in the world around us. It sends that information first through the brainstem and the base part of our brain here. This part of our brain is our breathing. It is whether we're sleepy or awake. It is our survival area of our brain. And so if you're hungry right now because you haven't eaten lunch yet or you're thirsty, this is the part of your brain that's controlling that, that's monitoring that, and helping to signal if you have needs there. It's the first part of our brain to process information. Between this base area of our brain and the middle area of our brain, where our feelings and our memories are, or our relationship part of our brain is, between there and communicating between these parts of the brain is something called the amygdala. The amygdala is really important because it's our smoke detector. If the amygdala detects smoke, it alarms. And so what you know about smoke detectors, though, is probably anybody who's burned popcorn knows, right? Smoke detectors don't go off when there's fire. They go off when there's smoke, when there's heat. And so smoke detectors, they're an on-off switch that is a sensor to let us know if there's danger. But there's not always danger. And oftentimes, 9 times out of 10, maybe more than that, it's just detecting smoke, right? It's not actual real danger. But the amygdala's job isn't to decide rationally if there's danger or not. It's to say, I think there's danger, we need to act. The last part of the brain to process information, first part right through our spinal cord up through our brainstem, then through this part of our brain, and the amygdala is kind of controlling the flow of traffic. The last part of our brain to process information is our prefrontal cortex up here. The cortex in this part of our brain, it does a lot of thinking and doing. I'm not going to talk much about that. Certainly has implications in trauma, but pretty directly here, the prefrontal cortex certainly does, because this is our rational, reasonable, logical part of our brain. This is the part that tells us back to ourselves what we're thinking. And so this logical part of our brain is the last part of our brain to process information that comes in. What we know is that the more stressed a brain is, the less the brain is fully integrated in processing up through, back and forth, all of the information. And so what that means then is that the more stressed we are, right, the less logical we're being, and possibly the more we're reactive. When our amygdala senses a threat, it sends us into fight, flight, freeze, or appease. And these survival reactions, fight, flight, freeze, or appease, they are our base part of our brain reacting, telling us we need to do something. We need to fight off whatever's threatening us. We need to get out of here and get away from the threat. We need to just say yes and go along with whatever's happening. Or we freeze up, which is often very much a trauma response, to just freeze and not do anything. Or in the animal kingdom, it would look kind of like playing dead. And so these reactions then, right, they flip our lid and they cut off this integrated process. And so what's happening is someone might be behaving less logical, right, and more reactively because they're having a survival reaction. We all have these. We all have these responses. With trauma, what happens is the brain rewires based on the traumatic event or events they've been through. And this signal, right, it becomes oversensitive. So imagine that smoke detector is oversensitized to sensing smoke, maybe sometimes with specific cues, and becomes overreactive. And so we see these responses. And think about how this happens and what this looks like in a family, right? A child is not trusting of their adult. The adult is just asking them to put their shoes on, but maybe there's some reminder of trauma that happens that we see or don't see. It's not always logical, right? And that child then is going into fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode, right? And maybe that child starts arguing and yelling at the parent just for being asked to put their shoes on. This is how trauma can have an impact on the brain. And certainly there's way, way more to understand here. But this is just an introduction to this process. Really quickly, the 3 R's just help us understand this functioning, this level structure of the brain, that right here, our need, right, if we're overwhelmed, is to regulate, to recover from adversity. Regulation is often helpful with rhythm. I've been trying to build into this presentation a little bit of regulation. Take a breath here, stretch here, notice what's in your body here. Relationships, right? They're here in this part of our brain. And if we're feeling stressed, relationships, connections to people who are secure connections to us can be helpful to keep our brain integrated, right? When we're feeling stressed. And when our brain is fully integrated, we're not stressed too much, just enough, right? A fully integrated brain, we can do that reasoning, we can do that processing, we can be in what's called the learning zone, and we can do the things that are typical in therapy. But this is why it's really important to understand, especially for those with trauma, but really for all people, we need to approach each person understanding, where are they at? What's their level of regulation? Are we working with a full brain here? Are we working with a stressed brain here that doesn't have as much access to reason? Are we working with someone who's overwhelmed? Do we need to just focus on regulating them and focus on safety? This is a really quick slide too. Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been around for 80 years. And what we know about the brain from neuroscience tells us that when Maslow was theorizing about our needs, they match up pretty well with the needs of our brain and the structure from base all the way to top. I just find that really fascinating. I'm not going to spend time here because I want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time talking about healing, trauma, and resilience. And so the elements for healing family trauma are focusing on those healthy attachments and building those healthy connections. Focus on regulation techniques and helping to teach, coach, and practice things that are effective for people who are feeling overwhelmed, who are having reactivity, and working on building competencies and those skills like communication skills, like emotion regulation, and other sorts of skills and strategies, and desensitizing from those impacts of trauma. These are resources that support resilience, mental health support, physical activity, and being outside. I'm a really big proponent of being in nature. I think it's really good for our brains and our nervous systems, especially for people who have had trauma, although it's important to note that everybody has a different relationship with nature. And maybe some people could have had trauma that is nature related. Think like catastrophic natural disasters. Advocacy and allyship is something that I don't want to understate, especially because poverty and discrimination and these other forms of social trauma are continuing to occur for a lot of people, and they need allies and they need advocates for them. And that will help us to break intergenerational cycles of trauma. Healthy relationships, hopefully that's understood as they're vital, but that also means maybe incorporating other people in therapy besides just individual work. Having healthy sleep, having balanced nutrition, and being connected to the community, including things like NAMI, can be really helpful as well. And so in families, to be supportive of young people and those in families with trauma, support from significant others, friends and family, support at school, support in the community, and for adult support at work. These are really important. Having feelings of safety and belongingness in all of these environments, having a sense of self-worth and contributing to something bigger than ourselves. This is one that we miss a lot with kids. Sometimes we over-accommodate and say like, well, you're barely managing and taking care of yourself, right? We don't want to ask you to do more, but contributing to something bigger than ourselves is so important to the meaning that we have in our lives. And so giving people helper roles, including those with trauma, including those with mental illness, can be really helpful, of course, as long as they're consenting. Having a belief in one's ability, having a sense of meaning and connectedness, including spiritual beliefs, can be really, really important. And having goals and dreams and talking about those goals and dreams. Possessing talents and skills, like in arts or sports or academics, and having coping skills. These are really, really important elements, and things that can be worked on one at a time or many at a time. But note, like most of these things include not just resources, but connections, relationships. And so caregivers who are working with children who have had trauma, developing a daily routine and having predictability, both at home and school and in all environments, advocating for supports in all environments, setting consistent expectations and holding limits firmly and warmly. Again, yes, accommodation is important, but also it's also important to still have consistent expectations and to have contribution in families. Praising the positives, noticing needs, making space for expression, giving lots of opportunities to play and for art and for time to be outdoors, connecting to healthy adults, and communicating with calm, with curiosity, and with empathy. Communicating calmly, communicating with curiosity, and communicating with empathy are so, so, so important for all kids, but especially for kids and young people who have experienced trauma. It's good for the adults too. So just take a moment to maybe appreciate yourself for being here. Maybe sending gratitude to the world for allowing you to have this resource, or some gratitude to NAMI for having me here with you. I think having gratitude is something that is really, really important and not always easy, and certainly not the only thing that matters, but can be really helpful. There are a couple slides here at the end. I'm going to hit pause on these because I want to make sure that there's time for questions here at the end. But again, just reinforcing from Dan Siegel the importance of curiosity, not just in caring for children, but also in discipline approaches. Two really quick notes. I think it's really important to state attention seeking is connection seeking. So when we hear that phrase, a child is seeking attention, think first instead of what are they doing, right? Think about what's happening. What are they needing? What are they trying to connect to? Our brains are wired to connect to meet our needs. And so when someone's attention seeking, especially a young person, they're trying to connect. And so we want to be able to tune into that. And curiosity is the best way to do this. One other thing that I think is really important, this is an advocacy piece for me, is that survival responses, things that are fight, flight, freeze, and appease, are really important to not punish because these things are happening reflexively. It's not necessarily in a child's control. And so we need to find other ways to help with discipline here. And this is probably a whole other presentation that we could have, and certainly conversations to have maybe with a therapist or other mental health provider. But I really wanted to reinforce this before I ended here and show resources. There's NAMI resources here in the slides. That can be super helpful. There's all the references. A lot of the information here are not my original ideas in this presentation, so I want to make sure that you have the references that I've used and have resources as well that you can look into. Any and all of these websites are really great websites to go to. If you're a provider and you've not visited the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website, go there. There's so many resources. It's so, so wonderful. If you want to learn more about ACEs, go to acesaware.org. And I would highly recommend any of these resources and these books that are here. All right, Matt, it's
Yeah.
12:56.
Thank you, Brian. Not seeing any more questions emerging, just a lot of um, appreciation from folks for this presentation. I know a few people were asking in the comments. So this is being recorded. So again, it will be posted to the YouTube channel for NAMI Greater Cleveland later this week. You will receive a follow-up email with the slides. There is also a link for the evaluation for Brian's presentation. If you could click that link and give us your honest feedback. And I did also put a link in the chat to we are offering another webinar on a topic related to trauma in August with another presenter on the topic of traumatic loss. So I did just put the link to register for that in the chat if you'd like to sign up for that one. You know, we're definitely open to continuing virtual programs are related to trauma, the topic of trauma, since that's clearly an area of great interest for many of us. So just wanted to get all of that out of the way. Again, not seeing any final questions, just a lot of gratitude and appreciation for this webinar. So that being said, thank you, Brian, for leading us through the last hour. And all of you joining us, look forward to receiving an email from me shortly with the slides and follow-up. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here.